Shalom and welcome. This episode will cover from Shem to Peleg, son of Eber. Let's quickly recap the origins of Semites, beginning with Natufians to Proto-Semites. The Natufian culture is a late Epi-Paleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant, dating to around 15,000 to 11,500 years ago. The culture was unusual in that it supported a sedentary or semi-sedentary population, even before the introduction of agriculture. The Natufian communities may be the ancestors of the first builders of the first Neolithic settlements in the region, which may have been the earliest in the world. According to Christy G. Turner II, there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relationship between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Natufian culture. According to the genetic analysis done on 6 Natufian remains from northern Israel, the Natufians carried the Y-DNA haplogroup E-Z830, a somewhat upwind clade of E-M123, and therefore ancestral to it. The Natufians were one of the first settled peoples in the world and may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops and thus the advent of agriculture. The discovery of E-Z830 without other clades suggests an indigenous presence in Canaan and Israel that predates all other clades, which are not known to have existed in the region at the time, 10,000 years before present. According to the paper titled The Prehistory of Language from the Perspective of the Y-Chromosome, it reads, in the 2005 book, First Farmers, The Origins of Agriculture Societies by Peter Bellwood, provides an excellent resource for linguists who wish to explore the worldwide correlation between the origins of agriculture and the expansion of languages. In Chapter 3 of the book, page 44 through 66, he explores the origins of agriculture in Southwest Asia, focusing on a region often identified in the literature as the Fertile Crescent. This region encompasses parts of contemporary Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The transition to agriculture in the Fertile Crescent was facilitated by the domestication of cereals such as wheat and barley and legumes such as chickpeas and lentils from wild sources. Additionally, the agricultural transition in the Fertile Crescent involved the domestication of goats and sheep. The success of agriculture in Southwest Asia partly stems from improved climatic conditions following the last ice age. Another factor that ensured the success of this transition was the development of pottery. Prior to the adoption of agriculture in Southwest Asia, and elsewhere in the world for that matter, the human tribe practiced hunter-gatherer techniques in order to survive. The evolution of agricultural in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begin with the Natufians, followed by the pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. The Natufians appeared near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. Bar Yosef paints a picture of everyday Natufian life, which centered on hunting of gazelles and other animals. Moreover, and more specifically, he reports that they practiced intensive and extensive harvesting of wild cereals that grew abundantly in the region at the time. According to the description provided by Bellwood in 2005, this abundant supply of food allowed the Natufians to construct semi-permanent settlements, something that is unusual for hunter-gatherers. These cultures are generally nomadic. People began to domesticate the wild cereals and legumes that their Natufian ancestors had previously gathered. The pre-pottery Neolithic A cultures stand as an initial Southwest Asian culture that embraced this new development. They and their descendants thrived, and by around 10,500 years ago, large farming settlements appeared, such as the one at Abu Huraira in northern Syria. This development signaled the evolution of another cultural transition in the region, the pre-pottery Neolithic B. One of the significant innovations that occurred during this period was the development of pastoralism and herding of goats and sheep, which were once wild animals that people had managed to domesticate. About 9,000 years ago, the development of pottery ushered in a new cultural transition in Southwest Asia. This development allowed people to cook their food more efficiently and facilitated the storage of grain after harvesting. Around this time, the climate in Southwest Asia also became more arid. According to Bellwood in 2005, this change in climate was accompanied by deforestation of human settlements had brought, as well as less productive soil due to over-farming. These conditions caused many people in Southwest Asia to abandon sedentary crop agriculture. Instead of cultivating crops, they turned to sheep and goat herding as a food source. By around 6.4 thousand years ago, some of these Southwest Asian pastoralists herded their goats and sheep out of the region into Egypt. Harefian is a specialized regional cultural development of the Epipaleolithic of Negev Desert. It corresponds to the latest stages of the Natufian culture. According to the book titled Early Pastoral Nomadism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia, Harefian has close connections with the late Mesolithic cultures of Phylum and the eastern deserts of Egypt, whose tool assemblages resemble that of the Harefian. Fusion with animal domestication elements of pre-pottery Neolithic B (PPNB) culture is hypothesized by Geoffrey Sea to have led to the Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex, a group of cultures that invented nomadic pastoralism. It may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic languages throughout the region. Pre-pottery Neolithic B is part of the Pre-pottery Neolithic, a Neolithic culture centered in Upper Mesopotamia and the Levant. Like their early PPNA people, the PPNB culture developed from the Mesolithic Natufian culture. Work at the site of Ain Ghazel in Jordan has indicated a later pre-pottery Neolithic C period, which existed between 8,200 and 7,900 BP. Geoffrey Sea has proposed that a Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex developed in the period from the climactic crisis of 6,200 BC, partly as a result of an increasing emphasis on PPNB cultures upon animal domesticates and a fusion with Harefian hunter-gatherers in southern Palestine, with affiliated connections with the cultures of Phylum in the eastern desert of Egypt. Cultures practicing this lifestyle spread down the Red Sea shoreline and moved east from Syria into southern Iraq. Ain Ghazel is a Neolithic archaeological site located in metropolitan Amman, Jordan. The settlement at Ain Ghazel first appeared in the Middle Pre-pottery Neolithic B. Y-DNA haplogroup E1b1b1b2 has been found in 75% of the Ain Ghazel population, along with 60% of PPNB populations, and is present in all three stages of PPNB and in most Natufians. More recently, Geoffrey Sea has suggested that the development of a Circum-Arabian nomadic pastoral complex of cultures developed in the period of the 6,200 BCE climactic crisis, stretching from southern Palestine down the Red Sea shoreline and northeastward into Syria and Iraq, spread Proto-Semitic languages through the region. This complex may have developed from the fusion of Harefian and pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures in southern Palestine. And according to the paper titled Bayesian Phylogenetic Analysis of Semitic Languages Identifies an Early Bronze Age Origin of Semitic in the Near East, and it reads, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin approximately 5,750 years before present in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Now let's harmonize everything. After the flood, Shem would have left the ark and settled the Levant. Shem's Stone Age descendants would be the Natufians and related populations. From Natufians would come PP&A, PP&C, and PP&B cultures. Natufians and their Neolithic Levantine descendants were the first agriculturalists and the first to domesticate sheep and goats. PP&B and Harifians in the Levant created the Proto-Semites. Proto-Semites formed in 6200 BC. Then Proto-Semites will expand from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia around 3750 BC, the early Bronze Age. When Semites expanded from the Levant, Abraham's ancestors could have been among those migrants. I believe the expansion of Proto-Semites in the early Bronze Age happened around the time of Peleg, because his name means division. And in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided, which could represent migration or expansion. Furthermore, Peleg has a brother named Joktan, and his descendants are Arabians. Around this time of the early Bronze Age, Semites were also migrating from the Levant into Arabia, which fits well with Joktan. Therefore, both Joktan and Peleg could have lived in this time period of expansion of Semites from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia. Therefore, Peleg and Joktan likely lived in the early Bronze Age. Therefore, Abraham's ancestors, which could be early descendants of Peleg, could have left the Levant in this time and migrated into Mesopotamia. Therefore, I would say that Peleg lived in the early Bronze Age, whereas Abraham would live in the Middle Bronze Age. Now, understanding the ancestors of Semites is pretty important if we are to understand the cultural and genetic background of Abraham and the Israelites. One thing that I find fascinating about the Natufians and their early descendants, the fact that they were the first agriculturalists and pastoralists, is that the patriarchs and the matriarchs essentially were the same thing. But this makes sense because the Natufians passed down their language and their culture and obviously their genes to their descendants, who would be Semitic populations such as Abraham. According to the article titled The Pastoral Lifestyle of Abraham and His Family, it reads, anthropological studies of this period and region suggest the families in these narratives practice a mixed semi-nomadic pastoralism and herdsman husbandry. Because a family could not be entirely supported through shepherd herding, it was necessary to practice local agriculture and trade with those living in more settled communities. Pastoral nomads cared for sheep and goats to obtain milk and meat, wool and other goods made from animal products such as leather. Donkeys carried loads, and camels were especially suited for long-range travel. The patriarchal narratives repeatedly mentioned the great wealth of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Shepherd herding and animal husbandry were honorable fields of work and could be lucrative, and Abraham's family became very wealthy. Now let's turn our attention to DNA. What would be the Y-DNA haplogroup of these Proto-Semites? And what will the autosomal breakdown of these Proto-Semites be? If Proto-Semites descend from Natufians, and if Proto-Semites are expanding from the Levant in the early Bronze Age, then it's highly likely that Proto-Semites would carry haplogroup E. According to Abdul Ramade from the Facebook page Y-DNA E-M35, it reads, through its younger E-M123 mutation, haplogroup E-M35 apparently has a major role in the peopling and inhabiting process of Mesopotamia, with current concludes coming from the available scientific literature. A brief history of the former via its chronological context reveals an almost uninhabitable area in the south with a weak, insecure presence of hunter-gatherers in the north during the onset of Paleolithic until the Mesolithic, which makes the PPNA agriculturalists arriving later from the Levant as the ultimate first sedentary settlers in Mesopotamia, existing in its northern sphere after a series of pre-6th through 7th millenniums BCE migrations. Although later in history PPNA settlers have advanced to the PPNB culture in most of the attributed sites, Mesopotamia, on the contrary, had a more complex record, with other cultures assimilating PPNA in between, and thus largely shaping the demographic case of the region, until additional migrations from the heartland southern Levant were recorded when semi-nomadic pastoralist groups reached the western and northern edges of Euphrates Valley regions and extending as far as northern Syria, the kind of migrations that are going to be known later as Akkadians, while those stationed in the south will be simply the future Sumerians according to archaeological theories. That was from G. Ackerman 2020 in To the Euphrates and Beyond Archaeological Studies. Although the alternate published genetic narrative had shedded much light on Near East's primitive migrations, there's still an up-to-date lack of direct Mesopotamian focused samples. However, this isn't the case of the former mentioned specimen of pre-Pottery Neolithic PPN cultures of the Levant. These that were found belonging in majority to E-M123 lineages after testing, Lazarus et al. 2016. The latest Levant genomic studies did furthermore introduce two recent important results from the Chalcolithic to Bronze Age site of Ebla in Syria and Arstelet-Tepe, ancient city of Milid, known to the Akkadians as Milidu, between 3400 through 2400 BCE of each. These new samples of ART015 and ETM010 were found belonging to E-CTS9608 clade after the study's E-M123 assignment, and interestingly this clade unites with most of the current day South Semitic speakers carrying E-M123 in Arabia at the E-PF6751 level. It's worth to note that the reason behind the dramatic adoption of nomadicism and late pastoral migrations of Levantine PPN groups was a climate overturn events, specifically affecting the Jordan Valley and southeast Levant with extreme aridity and droughtness, forcing agriculturalist dependent groups to rely more on domesticate animals and acclimate desert hunting practices. And this is pretty confirmed by direct archaeological evidences at present, and that was from Jairus Zarin's 1990 Early Pastoral Nomadism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia. These growing groups, according to the author, haven't only migrated north and east to Syria and Mesopotamia, but also further south to Arabia, expanding the Semitic languages landscape in each. Hence the discovery of E-CTS9608 clade in North Levant/East Anatolia, and other E-PF6751 clades in Arabia, would reflect the former's important rule among early Semitic speakers gene pool, and likely for Akkadians to be related in the E-CTS5265 level, if the discovered E-CTS9608 itself wasn't direct Akkadian. As regards to the primary genetic impact of PPNA agriculturalists, both studies of Nar-Shimhan et al. 2019 and Lazarus et al. 2016 did find a Levantine admixture in their Chalcolithic Iranian sample less than 5000 BCE. The same study had further reported a specific E-M123 variant, which is E-Y31991 among the Bronze Age cemetery of Pakistan's Swat Valley, with direct ties with the Iranian plateau, rather than direct Mesopotamian or Levants. The latest mentioned studies conducted on the Levant also showed an E-Z849 variant of E-M123 from Bronze Age Hazor, which is carrying an admixed autosomal of both Iran/Caucasus and local Levant. Hence, there is a possibility of it being a result of a back migration from these regions with an ancient PPNA origins. So here's a chart illustrating the migration of early Semites that would have carried haplogroup E starting from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia. The expansion of E markers from the Levant into Mesopotamia matches the exact same time as the expansion of Semites. And of course this makes sense because Semites are expanding from the Levant into Mesopotamia. And according to what we just read, it would have been Akkadians carrying these E markers into Mesopotamia. According to Geoffrey Sea, who is a historian and writer, he says, the spread of Semitic peoples. This map explains so much about the evolution of Semitic peoples. Its child E-M123 began a migration up the Red Sea and thereby became a main haplogroup of Semitic peoples, but it would be many thousands of years before Semitic languages originated. To interpret the map, the largest hotspot marks the area where E-M123 likely originated and originally diversified around the strait between Djibouti and Yemen. That cluster of diversity was reinforced about 4,000 years ago when Semites from the Levant backtracked down the Red Sea and colonized the strategic area around the strait, resulting in the spread of Semitic language into Ethiopia. The original migration up the Red Sea resulted in the Natufian culture of the Levant starting around 15,000 years ago. More than 90% of Natufians carried haplogroup E, much of that E-M123. Natufian descendants account for the hotspot around Israel. In the Neolithic period, some Natufian descendants migrated to the Caucasus region to join the Kovacs culture, accounting for the hotspot in Azerbaijan. A branch of Kovacs then expanded down into Mesopotamia, accounting for the hotspot on the map. The Akkadians also carried E-M123 in their invasion of Mesopotamia. Lastly, the exile of Judahites to Babylon brought a third batch of E-M123 to Mesopotamia. And according to Peter Solomon Kovacs, a historian and archaeologist, he says, E-M34 originated in northeast Africa, where the Proto-Semitic language also originated. This lineage also belongs to the founding Semitic lineage. Today, E-M34, it is especially linked to people from the Levant region or a Semitic connection to the Levant, where Proto-Semitic became the Semitic language and people. Israel, Jordan, Cyprus, Semitic Ethiopian Amhara, and Kurds. The founding Semitic lineage was in Y-DNA haplogroup E. I support the view that the Natufians were the first Proto-Semitic migrants to bring a version of the Proto-Semitic language out of Northeast Africa, where the Proto-Semitic language originated. Other Semitic migrants from Northeast Africa continued this process until the Semitic language formed in the Bronze Age. The Natufians were tested for ancient DNA and found exclusively in haplogroup E, E-P2, E-M215, E-Z830. Thus, the primary founding lineage of the Semitic people based on the Natufian data and present-day Semitic populations, Y-DNA, E-P2, E-M215, E-M35 to E-M78, West Semitic, and E-M35 to E-Z830 to E-M34, East Semitic. The Hebrews would have brought their own form of a Semitic language and unique paternal lineages into the Levant at the end of the Late Bronze Age, according to the Bible. And according to the Hebrew Bible that records their genealogies, their paternal lineages were also new to the Levant, from the late Bronze Age forward. Thus, my view that the founding Hebrew paternal lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to King David was also in Y-DNA haplogroup E in the Northwest Semitic branch of E-M35 to E-M78. From what we just read, various historians and geneticists are essentially saying that Semites expanded from the Levant, and when they spread from the Levant, these Semites would have carried haplogroup E. And of course, this fits well with the latest studies dealing with the origins of Semitic languages and people, that they come from the Levant, and that early Semitic migrants like the Akkadians would have traveled from the Levant into Mesopotamia. And of course, there are genetic papers and articles that illustrate that these early Semites would have carried haplogroup E into Mesopotamia. And all of this makes sense if Semites descend from Natufians, and Natufians carried haplogroup E. According to the paper, Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East. It reads, "We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin approximately 5,750 years before present in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia." And according to the paper titled How Eurasia Was Born, it reads, "The most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration to the Fertile Crescent, with TMRCAs, the most common recent ancestors, fitting the arrival of the Akkadians and other early Semitic peoples, are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12, with relatively early TMRCAs present in the Middle East could be candidates for such remigration, such as E-FGC 14382, TMRCA is 2200 BCE, and E-V3262, TMRCA is 2600 BCE. And according to the article titled Haplogroup J is definitely not Semitic in origin, it reads, "According to the theory, Afro-Asiatic languages spread to Asia via E1b haplogroup, not J1. It is historically known that a ruling elite class of Afro-Asiatic people, Akkadians, Assyrians, etc., also invaded the north of Mesopotamia and brought their Afro-Asiatic languages to the central and northern parts of Mesopotamia during the period of Akkadians and Babylonians. Elite dominance model of E1b1 might be supposed for Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In this sense, it might be theorized that Sumerian was the main language of the ancient Mesopotamians before Afro-Asiatic E1b overwhelmed Mesopotamia, elite dominance model." With all that being said, the evidence seems to point to haplogroup E being the founding lineage of Semitic people, and that Semites expanded from the Levant. The Levant is their homeland, and they left going into Mesopotamia and Arabia, carrying the E marker. And you can quite literally see this migration take place if you look at the ages of the samples. The oldest haplogroup E samples in the Middle East are from the Natufians. But as you expand outwards from the Levant into Mesopotamia, the samples we find of E get younger and younger, from the Natufians to the pre-pottery Neolithic B to the early Bronze Age and the late Bronze Age / early Iron Age. According to the genetic analysis done on 6 Natufian remains from northern Israel, the Natufians carried the Y-DNA haplogroup E-Z830, a somewhat upland clade of E-M123, and therefore ancestral to it. The Natufians were one of the first settled peoples in the world, and may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops, and thus the advent of agriculture. The discovery of E-Z830, without other clades, suggests an indigenous presence in Canaan and Israel, and predates all other clades, which are not known to have existed in the region at the time, 10,000 years before present. Haplogroup E1b1b2 has been found in 75% of the Angazelle population, along with 60% of PPNB populations circa 8,800 through 6,500 BC. A study on population genomics of Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Levant found in Arslan Tepe one individual who lived circa 3369 through 3110 BC who belonged to E-M84, A study on the population genomics of Bronze Age Eurasia found the remains in Narkim, Getshan, and Armenia lived during the Middle Bronze Age to E-M84. A study on population genomics of Anatolia and the Caucasus and the Levant found in the ancient city of Ebla during the Bronze Age one male individual who carried E-M84. A study on South Asian history, Narstingham et al. 2019 found several individuals who belonged to E-Y-31991 in late Bronze Age/early Iron Age samples in the Swat Valley, modern northern Pakistan. So as you can see, the E samples get younger and younger as one leaves the Levant going into Mesopotamia, from the Natufians all the way to the early Bronze Age when Semites expanded from the Levant. With that being said, our final question is this. What would be the autosomal makeup of early Semitic populations and Abraham? Well, if Natufians are the ancestors of Semites, then early Semitic populations are going to carry Natufian DNA. The Natufian culture. It was an epi-Paleolithic culture that existed from 12,500 to 9,500 BC in the Levant. The Natufian culture is the name given to the sedentary, late epi-Paleolithic hunter-gatherers living in the Levant region of the Near East between about 12,500 and 10,200 years ago. The Natufians foraged for food such as emmer wheat, barley, and almonds, and hunted gazelle, deer, cattle, horses, and wild boar. The direct descendants of the Natufians, known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic or PPN, were among the earliest farmers on the planet. And if you look to the right hand side of the screen, you'll see the distribution of Natufian DNA and ancestry. This next chart illustrating Natufian DNA comes from Quora, titled "Whose Ancestry Became Most Widespread Over the Millennia Up to Modern Times, that of Neolithic Farming People from Anatolia, Levant, Iran, or the Caucasus." And it reads, "Using a genetic ancestry model with about 20 key reference ancient populations from all over the world, I modeled a large sample of more than 400 modern population groups. Generally ethnic groups, regional populations, or entire nationalities that I have access to via the public Global 25 dataset. After that, I created maps, see below, with the following legend: darkest tone plus 30%, medium tone between 10% and 30%, light tone between 5% and 10%. The earliest farmers from the Levant, who were the culmination of the sedentary and complex hunter-gatherer culture of the Natufians, spread mostly southward and southwestward into Africa and were apparently encroached in their own homeland by Anatolia, Iranian, and Caucasian farmers as they expanded, though it preserves high presence in the southern Levant, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. Thus, the genetic ancestry derived from or closely related to the Natufians from the Levant is less widespread in the Old World than the Anatolian one, but its geographic expanse is also very remarkable, particularly in Africa. So again, this is just another map showing the genetic distribution of Natufian DNA and ancestry. And here's another map from Anthrogenica, and it shows the distribution of Levant's Neolithic DNA and ancestry. And now, as we can see, it's widespread throughout the Middle East as well as the Mediterranean and North Africa. And here's a breakdown of Natufian ancestry and DNA from Punt's DNA LK12 Ancient World, and the highest form of Natufian DNA is in the Middle East as it expands outwards into Africa and the Mediterranean. Now here is the distribution of Semites and Natufian ancestry. The overlap is perfect. The natural border of Semites seems to be above Syria and Iraq, but this is also where Natufian DNA also begins to be less. The Semitic genome is highly likely Natufian. When it comes to modern Semitic populations, it's actually Yemenis, Bedouins, and Arabians that have the highest amount of Natufian DNA. And these groups biblically would likely be descendants of Joktan, who is the ancestor of Arabians and the close genetic relative to Abraham through Eber. These Yemeni populations also carry up to 25 to 50% of Haplogroup E. According to the paper titled Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern-Day Arabians and Iranians, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human remains, it reads, modern Saudi Arabians and Yemeni samples clustered tightly in the lower left quadrant, overlapping with the 3 Natufian samples, and were close to the Levant PPNB, PPNC, and Levant Bronze Age samples. And according to DNA consultants, it reads, 3 of the individuals had Y chromosomes belonging to haplogroup E1b1, which likely originated in East Africa and is also found in early Neolithic farmers from Jordan. Natufian genomes also show similarity to modern-day populations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Bedouin nomadic peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemenis and Saudis have between 57% to 71% of Natufian-related ancestry. Other Semitic populations in the Middle East have high amounts of Natufian DNA as well, from 50% up to 60%. As an example, Yemenite Jews can carry 59% of Natufian DNA. Iraqi Jews can carry upwards to 56% of Natufian DNA. Iranian Jews can carry 55% of Natufian DNA. The Druze can carry 55% of Natufian DNA. The Assyrians carry 55% of Natufian DNA as well. The Palestinians can carry 54% of Natufian DNA. The Lebanese can carry around 53% of Natufian DNA. Jordanians can carry 52% of Natufian DNA, and Syrians can carry 51% of Natufian DNA, and the list goes on. What's also interesting about this is that these Semites also carry decent amounts of haplogroup E. As an example, Samaritans in Israel from the tribe of Levi carry up to 100% of haplogroup E. The Arabs in Egypt carry 68% of haplogroup E. Arabs in Jordan carry 44% of haplogroup E. Arab Palestinian Christians carry 31% of haplogroup E. The Parsi in Iran of Tehran carry 30% of haplogroup E. The Assyrians carry 22% of haplogroup E. The Lebanese carry 19% of haplogroup E. The Druze carry 18% of haplogroup E, and the list goes on. But one thing I find fascinating about Natufian DNA is how much it overlaps and matches up perfectly with Afro-Asiatic populations. If you look at a genetic distance chart and see who's closest genetically to the Natufians, it's mainly Afro-Asiatic populations. But you can go even further with this and look at a distribution map of Afro-Asiatic populations and Natufian DNA and see that they both overlap beautifully. But this makes a lot of sense because Natufians are the ancestors of Afro-Asiatic populations. According to the paper titled The Prehistory of Language from the Perspective of the Y-Chromosome, it reads, Bellwood in 2005, based on his interpretation of the archaeological data, suggests that Afro-Asiatic languages initially evolved in Southwest Asia and co-expanded out of this region with the spread of agriculture. Interestingly, linguistic data may also support this model of Afro-Asiatic origins. Using linguistic reconstruction, Matorev in 2002 presents a Proto-Afro-Asiatic lexicon of farming terminology. Based on the reconstructions, he suggests that the Natufians, agriculture, and Afro-Asiatic co-evolved in Southwest Asia. Finally, another reason for identifying Southwest Asia as a punitive homeland of Afro-Asiatic languages is Y-chromosome data as presented below in section 4 and 5. According to the paper titled Prehistory of a Dispersal of Proto-Afrosan, Proto-Afroasiatic Farming Lexicon, it reads, the identification of Proto-Afrosans as Natufians and Post-Natufians seems to satisfy all the four criteria. Besides the farming lexicon, there are sets of reconstructed Proto-Afrosan terms pointing to incipient animal breeding, a wide variety of dwelling and settlement types, a territory characterized by both desert and steep forest type of terrain, and drying riverbeds, as well as deep permanent streams, a vegetation typical of such terrain, and animals whose bones have been found at the Natufian and early Neolithic post-Natufian sites. Interestingly, there is a large number of common Afrosan terms denoting flocked ungulate animals, usually inhabiting steppes and semi-deserts. Finally, the Levant appears to be an attested region from where population began to spread starting in the early Neolithic, covering not only wide tracts of southwestern Asia, but also the adjacent parts of the Mediterranean and Africa. And according to the paper titled Proto-Afrosan Lexicon, Confirming West Asian Homeland Pastoralism, and it reads, the article presents one more step towards the equation of the culture of speakers of Proto-Afrosan, reconstructed on the basis of paleolinguistic data, with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture of the Levant. According to the glottal chronological method of S.A. Starstrom, Proto-Afrosan is dated back to approximately 10,000 BC, the same period as post-Natufian, supposed to be the cradle of agriculture and livestock breeding on the planet. As far as radiocarbon dating tells us, the article offers evidence for the presence of a layer of pastoral lexicon in Proto-Afrosan in the form of 26 reconstructed names for large and small cattle and various other pastoral terms. The objective of the present paper is to present further evidence, this time referring to pastoralism presumably practiced by Proto-Afrosan speaking community for the identification of this community with early Levantine farmers associated with the early Neolithic post-Natufian culture. These villagers, some of them, are the earliest known archaeological evidence for the cultivation of domesticated crops, cereals, and plus, and the raising of domesticated livestock. It is for archaeologists to evaluate the correspondences between the archaeological evidence from the Levant, as well as adjacent regions, and the reconstructed terminology referring to incipient agro-pastoralism in the Proto-Afrosan language, dated by the new version of the linguistic method glottal chronology to approximately the same period 12,000 through 10,500 BP, and presumably the same area. This is part of the broader project aimed at drawing a most comprehensive picture featuring practically all aspects of life of early Neolithic people in the Near East, which can be drawn from reconstructed Proto-Afrosan lexicon, namely terms referring to people and society, economic life and technology, intellectual culture, and natural and physical environments. This is all pretty important to understand because Natufians are the ancestors of Afro-Asiatics and Semites are an Afro-Asiatic people. And of course, Shem is the father of Semitic people. According to Britannica Semitic people, Semite, member of a people speaking any of a group of related languages presumably derived from a common language, Semitic. And according to Britannica Semitic languages that form a branch of the Afro-Asiatic language phylum. Members of the Semitic group are spread throughout North Africa and Southwest Asia and have played preeminent roles in the linguistic and cultural landscape of the Middle East for more than 4,000 years. Afrosan, a large family of related languages spoken in Asia and Africa. Semitic, a major branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. Hebrew, a member of any of a group of Semitic peoples who inhabited ancient Palestine and claimed descent from the biblical patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Semites are an Afro-Asiatic Semitic people, and Hebrews would also be an Afro-Asiatic Semitic people. And Natufians are the ancestors of Afro-Asiatic Semites. And both Natufians and Proto-Afro-Asiatics carried haplogroup E, which gives more credence to Semites being E carriers. According to the book titled In Hot Pursuit of Language in Prehistory, it reads, this paper makes an additional inference since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. And according to the paper titled Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus reveals core of West Eurasian ancestry, and it reads, such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y-chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. And according to the Cambridge book Transition to Modernity, and it reads, given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebelite and Akkadian, early Semitic languages, are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. And according to the paper titled Y-Chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralism, it reads, the Proto-Afro-Asiatic group carrying the E-P2 mutation may have appeared at this point in time and subsequently gave rise to the different major population groups inhabiting current speakers of the Afro-Asiatic languages and pastoralist populations. When you put all of this together, the distribution of Afro-Asiatic populations, along with the distribution of Natufian DNA, as well as the distribution of haplogroup E, you see a perfect overlap, a beautiful picture that lines up with everything that we covered. Genetically speaking, Abraham and his ancestors would have been like typical other Afro-Asiatic populations. They would have been typically Afro-Asiatic, which means that they would have carried Natufian DNA and they would have carried Y-chromosome haplogroup E, and I don't see any reason why they would be any different from other Afro-Asiatic populations. After all, with Abraham being a Semite, Proto-Semitic populations would have most definitely carried haplogroup E. According to the article titled E1B1B from Eupedia, it reads, E-M34 is the main Middle Eastern variety of E1B1B and is thought to have arrived with Proto-Semitic people in the late Copper to early Bronze Age. This would be Abraham's ancestors. And with Abraham and his ancestors being Semitic, this also makes them Afro-Asiatic, and most Afro-Asiatic populations carry the Yap gene or Yap descendant. According to the book In Hot Pursuit of Language in Prehistory, most of the Afro-Asiatic speakers share the lineage defined by Yap descendant called PN2/215/M35. Furthermore, Levant Bronze Age samples carried around 63% of Natufian ancestry. Therefore, Abraham and his ancestors could have had around that much of Natufian DNA or even more. Therefore, I conclude that genetically speaking, Abraham would be typically Afro-Asiatic, therefore he would carry haplogroup E and Natufian DNA. And Abraham's ancestors would have expanded from the Levant in the early Bronze Age around the time of Peleg, and these Semites would have carried E markers and Natufian DNA throughout the Middle East, because Semites descend from the Natufians. Natufians are the best example for the Stone Age descendants of Shem after the flood. Shem would have settled the Levant. This is according to extra-biblical sources. According to the University of California Press conception of the conquest of the land during the Second Temple period, and it reads, according to the book of Jubilees chapter 8, Shem the son of Noah inherited the entire idle land of Israel from the Euphrates to the Red Sea. Later the Canaanites took the land by force and therefore cursed. Jubilees chapter 10 verse 29 through 34. The claim that the land of Canaan had actually been a part of Shem's inheritance that was then stolen by the Canaanites also appears in rabbinic sources. We read, for example, the Mishnah on Genesis chapter 12 verse 6. The Canaanites were then in the land, for the land of Israel was cast in the lot of Shem, as it is written, and Melchizedek the king of Shalom. Therefore I conclude that since Shem settled the land first, and the Natufians are the best population in the Levant to represent the ancestors of Semites, the Natufians would be the Stone Age descendants of Shem after the flood. Then in the early Bronze Age, Proto-Semitic populations will expand from the Levant. This will be around the time of Peleg, and Abraham's ancestors will be part of that migration out of the Levant into Mesopotamia. Abraham's Proto-Semitic ancestors would have carried Haplogroup E as well as other Semitic populations, and they would have carried Natufian DNA. Therefore, Natufian DNA and Haplogroup E is the marker of Afro-Asiatic Semitic ancestry. With that being said, be blessed and shalom.